Hello, everyone. I'm Tiffany Vora. I am the Vice Chair of Digital Biology and Medicine at Singularity University and a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Geotech Center. I am here today, thanks to Teleportech, to be having a great conversation with Shahreen Reza, who is the CEO and founder of Astrius. Now, Shahreen, welcome, and why don't you tell us a bit about yourself?
Thank you so much, Tiffany. I'm the CEO of Astrius, and for me, what's so exciting about being involved in these conversations is understanding how small the space community is and how well-defined the tech world is in terms of what they do in tech, what they do in space, and seeking new innovation. So I am the former deputy head of global business from Palantir Technologies. I also worked on their intelligence arm. After that, I was very hungry to start my own company, Astrius. It's actually my second startup. My first startup was Pure Fate. It was a clean tech water company using the byproduct of Scotch whiskey to decontaminate arsenic poison water. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you this morning.
Well, I'm really glad to be with you as well. Shahreen and I are both coming to you all from Silicon Valley. We're both founders, we're both working in the tech industry, and one of the things that I think we both have in common is an ability to see these convergences among various industries that previously were separate. So Shahreen, I want to hear a bit more about Astrius and what you're working on. So spoiler alert, space and food coming together. So tell us more about that.
Definitely. So my team actually is an amazing composition of Michelin star chefs, aerospace engineers. We have former NASA astronauts. We have engineers who understand manufacturing, but at the other side, we have bone biologists, nutritional biochemists. And the concept behind Astrius is we looked to astronauts to create the optimal brain food for the health of people who are in their peak performance in the most inhospitable environments imaginable, but then bringing it back to Earth. And in so doing, not only do we understand the constraints of space, but also what is required in Earth to make it more sustainable, since we now realize that climate change is real. We had, I believe, over 1 million acres of forest burned down in Washington and Oregon alone. So for us, it's that convergence of what is relevant with future food systems for space on Earth, and how can we make that a reality versus just theoretical debate.
Mm-hmm. And what gets you most excited in the morning when you head to work?
I think for me, especially on a Monday morning where a lot of people have the Monday blast, it's the people that we work with, like having a chance to engage with those who are in the top tier of their areas, my own team, but also having these conversations with you and realizing that it's a very inspiring world out there. Last week, I was fortunate enough to give a talk at the UN Austria Symposium, and the talk was at, I believe it was 2:50 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, because it was in Austria. And while I was kind of like, oh my God, this is an early morning talk, just being in it and realizing the discussions that are happening and what people are now working on, we are in this new wave of the space race. And so that to me is the most engaging, just the people who we are having these conversations with and seeing ideas become reality actively.
Well, I want to click on this a bit more because I think you're highlighting a really important theme here. When we think about space as an industry, space today is so different from space 20 years ago, 40 years ago, even 10 years ago. And I guess I would pull on that two ways, and then I'd like to hear what you think. First is this idea that it's commercialized, right? It's private companies getting into the space rather than just big governments. And at the same time, I feel like it's a far more international endeavor, a far more democratized endeavor than it was in the past, where you had the USSR and then Russia, you also had the United States. And for a really long time, that was it. But you're out there on the front lines. What are you seeing?
No, I completely agree with you. And to that extent, I'd also love to hear more about the international exposure you've had, because for me, just talking about the UN speak that I gave, the representation was very diverse, not just in terms of geographic representation, but also women. You had women from the Nigeria Space Agency, and I didn't even know that there was a Nigerian space agency. So it was so warming to see this. We have people from Japan talking about their commercial endeavors with food and agriculture. And I think the other part is when it comes to space, because it's a place where a lot of it are people who are just motivated in terms of what they would like to do as a dream versus motivated by money alone, you have that opportunity to see people coming from places where they aren't necessarily at an advantage. We had a woman presenting, and she was not someone who had a plethora of funding, but you could see that her research was something that spoke volumes to the work that she was doing. She's putting it out there, she's publishing. And so for me, it's having that ability to not just hear what's out there, but seeing that diversity in, geographic location and gender and representation in terms of, are you scientific? Are you coming from, a culinary standpoint? So I'd love to know, Tiffany, what kind of, engagements have you had there, and how have you find the representation changing now from what it was 20 years ago?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, so much. So I'll just tell you a bit, since you talked about how there's this love in the space industry. I think you can see it on my face that it really lights me up as well. So, when I was a kid, when I was a very little kid, I lived in Florida, and we used to stand in our backyard and watch shuttle launches as they happened. And I actually remember standing in my backyard as a kid and watching the Challenger explosion happen with my own eyes, when I was quite young. I'm not going to tell you how young, because then you'll know exactly how old I am. But I never really lost that feeling that there was this amazing endeavor going on, and it was literally happening in my backyard. And so, when I was in college, I became more interested in biology and in chemistry and in medicine. And it kind of seemed like a side thing. But then when I was in grad school, I read a book called The Case for Mars by Robert Zubrin of the Mars Society, where he was basically saying a long time ago, like, look, we don't actually need this to be a massive nation state endeavor. The technology is getting to the point where with an investment of a few $1 billion, we could actually get boots on the ground in Mars in a reasonable amount of time. Now, that was back in the early 2000s. So again, 20 years ago now. And thanks to the Mars Society, I started doing Mars simulations. So I've actually been to Mars 3 times in analog simulations, twice in the Utah desert and one in the high Canadian Arctic near the North Pole. And so I did that when I was in graduate school. I didn't really think of it as a focus, but again, was on a fellowship from NASA for my own research into DNA protein interactions and radiation sensitivity and all this fancy stuff, systems biology that we were doing back then. And then when I moved into being a professor, so I was a professor at the American University in Cairo. And so I had a chance to leave the West and to go to the Middle East and to actually see, what does engineering look like? What does young science look like? How are we bringing people into these fields? And of course, there's the gender issue in the Middle East as well. So I got a really great sense of that. And then when I left Egypt and I came back to Silicon Valley, I started working in the innovation startup ecosystem and also working with some really large multinationals. I got involved again in some of the space industries peripherally. Now I'm excited to be doing this more centrally, because what I'm seeing, just like you said, is more representation, more democratization, more diversity and inclusivity in ways that I would never have predicted before. I mean, I can remember, hopefully this will make you laugh, Shahreen, on my analog missions, I had a terrible time because the spacesuits were all too big for me. I am 5'2". I am a small Asian woman. And that stuff was just not made for me. And so thank God for duct tape. That was the only way I could make anything fit, the least glamorous thing you can think of. But now I'm excited to see space agencies from places around the world where people have different body formulations, different gender expectations, how many women we're getting up there, how many people who I don't identify as male or female. We're not there yet, but I think that's where they're heading. And so when I picture what the future of not just the space industry and space business, but what the future of humanity looks like, for me, this is a real part of it. It's not a pipe dream anymore. It's a moonshot in the sense that we're making it happen. It's hard, but we've got a plan and we've got lots of folks contributing to this. And it's a kind of a funny week for me. I'm doing 2 space engagements this week, one with you for Explore Mars, which I'm really excited about. We're going to be talking about how space research is benefiting life on Earth. And then actually the way I met Shahreen was through a wonderful group called Humanity in Deep Space, which is thinking about, okay, let's assume that we can solve all the technical problems. We got the rockets, we got the life support, we got the agriculture. Let's assume we've got all that figured out. Who do we want to be when we get there? Who do we want to be as humans when we get to Mars or when we get to deep space or someplace else? And those are conversations that are really early, but I know that I've been really excited to meet folks like Shahreen, but also to talk to poets and architects and geneticists and anthropologists and all these people who are just like, okay, but then what happens? So I love seeing those conversations happen. I love seeing this growth of the business. And man, I'm just really excited to see what comes next. What excites you?
To be honest, something that really excites me is looking at the way we perceive space in science fiction in the past and where we are now. I mean, a classic is 2001: A Space Odyssey, where back then the idea of having a video conference was so outlandish. And now here we are having a video conference in a time where COVID has made this normal. The other one that I find really interesting is in the world of social media, everyone has a voice now. Everyone has the opportunity to, be out there in the public, and the younger generations are, a step ahead of us in terms of how they're getting media out there. But the reason I mention this is oftentimes this concept of space and the romanticization behind it has come from what we read, what we view in the movies. I remember The Martian was, the first exposure I had to what it means to have agriculture in Mars. But
potatoes and human feces. I
know
better.
And yet when it comes to the way Hollywood portrays space and where we are going now, the other step I want to take is understanding where the growth of technology happens in a way that's not necessarily ackled by politics alone. Like we have some political tension with China right now, which we didn't have in the past. And yet in the past, we had political tension with Russia. But if you look at the ISS and the composition of the ISS, it's very much the cosmonauts and the astronauts together. So we've recently been having conversations with Axiom, which is the commercial space station that's going out there. So for me, it's quite fascinating to see, politically, how do we position ourselves in terms of our ambition for space, in terms of entertainment, how do movies position where we want to be in space? And the reason I talk about movies is because as children, that's kind of what we looked upon as, I'd like to be an astronaut because that's how, astronauts live. And now that we're looking at businesses actually anchoring their way into the new space race and the avenues, there's a lot of satellite companies, there's a lot of interest for, data. We're looking into food, sustenance. How do you actually have astronauts thrive in terms of nutrition? But how is that all captured in the world of entertainment? And for me, the world of entertainment is quite interesting because oftentimes it's what frames discourse amongst the younger generations. So that's also something I'd like to talk about when it comes to the youth and how they want to view space, because they're the ones who are going to be building out the new companies, the new jobs, the new industries that we don't necessarily know. Looking in the rearview mirror, we can see where we are in life now, but our parents didn't have that perspective. So I'm also curious to see when it comes to trends and up and coming industry changes, where do you think things are going?
Yeah. Gosh, I mean, I completely agree with you about the next generations being the ones that are going to be getting a lot of this done. I think we're going to be doing the commercialization and the tech work. And then it's probably more likely that my son, rather than myself, will be setting foot on another planet or in a space station. So my son is 10. How old is your son, Shahreen?
He's 2 years old. And I actually don't want him to be an astronaut because I know how dangerous it is. Apparently, being an astronaut is more dangerous than being a Formula One race car driver.
I remember my son, when he was about your son's age, telling me that he wanted to be a test pilot. And I was like, you are not going to be a test pilot. And he said, but how else am I going to learn to fly a rocket? I was like, you're not going to learn to fly a rocket. And he's like, but I want to. And I said, test pilots don't like ice cream. And he's like, oh, could I just have the ice cream? I said, yes, very good, sweetie. So I managed to brainwash him a little bit there. Yes. Okay. So, however, what I am waiting for is the day when space flight becomes as boring and as routine as getting in a car or getting in an airplane. Getting in a car is actually not a safe proposition, which is one of the reasons I'm so excited by self-driving cars. I used to be an emergency medical technician cleaning up accidents on the New Jersey Turnpike. So I know what it looks like. What I would rather see again is a future. I mean, do I want space to be boring? No, I'm not actually sure how it ever could be boring. But I would really like to see a time when it should be safe. And the space shuttle program was supposed to give us that, right? And it largely did. We had hundreds of launches that were perfectly safe, that managed to do what they needed to do when they needed to do it. And that was great. But we had two very sad, very tragic, very high visibility failures. And again, when you do the math on that, it's an interesting calculation. So my goal, for my hope, is for my son, that when my son goes, I'm like, okay, see you in 3 years, sweetie. Have a great time studying abroad on Mars or whatever it's going to be. So I think too, that normalization for these younger generations not just of technology, but of this kind of space idea is a really important thing, right? My son cannot conceive of life without the internet. He can't picture it. I very clearly remember using Telnet in my dorm when I was in college and calling the registrar on the phone to get my grades, right? And that kind of conceptualization, my son he can't live in a world where Siri doesn't respond when he says her name. It doesn't make sense to him. I would also love to see a future where, again, going to space or having space business or working in the space industry, it's just kind of another job. And I don't believe that will take the magic away. I think that will make the magic more accessible to more people around the world and allow us to build ever more elaborate industries, explore ever more elaborate and empowering technologies. And for me, a lot of the work that I do now is thinking about keeping people at the center of all this. We don't want to do, in my opinion, we don't want to do technology for technology's sake. I think, again, we're seeing some interesting techlash now where folks are saying, well, wait a minute, are we doing social media for social media's sake, or is this really about people? So how do you respond, Shahreen, to people who say something like, we have so many problems here on Earth, why should we spend money going to space? Or why should we spend money to spend more robots, to send robots and rockets to space? What about the people? What are your thoughts about that?
I find that really interesting, just reflecting on the world of food and why space is relevant to that extent. Recently, I've been having discussions with friends on the West Coast who've been driving through areas where the forest fires are hitting hard. I actually had a friend who had to be evacuated because the forest fires were just right there in his backyard. And I mention it because while actively we are aware that climate change is real, we still have the rainforest burning down in the Amazon. And the reason I talk about this is when it comes to space, the idea is, well, we mucked it up on Earth, so we'll just go and colonize Mars. We'll start something new. What people don't understand is how truly inhospitable those environments are. So when we're investing in space, it's not just that we're investing in a way to start a new, spacefaring civilization, rather understanding what innovation in space can do to maintain the environment we have on Earth. We can't turn back the clock and make things better, but we can have greater cognizance of saving spaceship Earth. And so particularly the elements that are quite interesting to me is sustainability, and sustainability with regard to energy usage, and sustainability with regard to waste. There is so much waste, especially in the food industry, not just recycling of plastics, but wastage of food alone, which can lead to so many more emissions than people would imagine. There's a lot of conversations on cows and, we should just have a vegan diet. But what people don't understand is how you mess up the agriculture if you're just eating avocado, if you're just having impossible meats where the base is soy, and soy is just as devastating agriculturally if that's all that you're focusing on. And so what space makes us do is makes us focus on how can you sustain with a very light footprint, understanding you're carrying all the waste with you, understanding that you're extremely limited in resources. But then if you can reverse engineer that to have impact on Earth in a way that also adds to the profitability of a company, that to me is a way forward, which connects this idea of space to now. And why is that relevant to people? So even when we're talking about human health, what happens to the human body in space is an acceleration to what happens to the human body on Earth. You shouldn't eat a lot of salt in space because sodium is not helpful for your bone that's already, having problems in microgravity. But on Earth, you see those issues cropping up in your body 10, 20 years down the road, but we don't talk about it. We talk about COVID, but then one of the top killers is eating too much salt. It's not sexy, but space is sexy. So if you can find a way of weaving something that is aspirational into something that affects us in everyday life, that's where I see the importance of investing in space, because you're investing in R&D, you're investing in research that does draw a relevance to our lives every day here.
Now, you all are doing some work with Aleph Farms, right? As long as we're talking about cows, let's talk about what you can share for a minute. So Aleph Farms is a cellular agriculture company in Israel that got some press a few months ago for making the first 3D printed steaks, if I'm not mistaken. How are you talking with them and what are you picturing?
Yes, well, that's actually really exciting because we have just submitted to the Deep Space Food Competition. And so hopefully we'll find the results of the challenge end of this month. So our work with Aleph Farms is actually making the food taste delicious. And in space, when you're flying up there, the microgravity impacts your ability to taste food. So the body fluid shift impacts in such a way that it's almost as though you're flying around with a head cold. So you can't smell things the same way, which is also why during COVID, you've had situations where people say they can't smell. But what happens is about 80% of what you perceive as taste is actually your olfactory sensation. It's what you're smelling. So then you have things like trigeminal stimulation. It's why NASA astronauts talk about their love of sriracha sauce. They just love pouring that in because this spice opens up the passageway so you have a chance to taste the food. But you can't just pour you cannot just pour sriracha sauce on all of your food in space because it'll mess up your biome system. And so what we do is we find nuanced, subtle ways of making food taste delicious without putting copious amounts of sodium and hot sauce in there to create that taste profile. And it's also relevant on Earth because when you look at industries, oftentimes the cheap tricks that industries play is they pump food filled with sugar and salt to make them taste good, because otherwise you have to use very high quality ingredients. So we're taking a step back and applying the same food science that you would use at a Michelin star restaurant into food that then can be manufactured on scale so that people have a chance to experience high quality food that doesn't have the same industry hacks of adding too much salt and too much sugar. And the reason I mentioned that in association with Alec Farms is they're creating steak. They're making it with real bovine serum. You have massive companies like the Impossible Burgers and Beyond Meat that are having billions of dollars of funding behind them because people are jumping into this idea of eating plant-based food. What they forget to realize is plant-based food may sound healthy on the outset, but it's actually junk food. If you look at the level of sodium that is in an Impossible Burger, it's more sodium than an average beef burger. And that's because the meat itself tastes very bland. And so they inject the salt in order that people have the same, flavor profile where they're like, okay, this is a delicious food, but it's a mind trick. So what we want to do is we want people to understand what makes you desire a food product. So that way the investment that goes into big companies are actually leaning towards one's health as opposed to the big trends. So plant-based is a huge trend right now, but I caution one's perception of that being healthier, because if you look at the chemical composition behind it, it's almost as though back in the day when we were talking about having, the farm to table, now we've gone full circle and we're like, okay, let's forget the farm altogether. Let's manufacture something entirely, within labs and then bring it to your table and you assume that it's good for you. So that's kind of the balance that we strike between what is truly healthy, what is tasty, and having the psychology of pleasure paired with good nutrition. So you want to eat something that your body will like, but your mind will also desire.
I completely agree. I mean, in our family, we've got two biologists in this house, one of whom is a very serious microbiome researcher. And we eat Beyond Meat and we eat Impossible, but we have not used it as substitutes for meat. We use it as its own thing, as a special treat, because to us, it's processed food. And for me in our house, if we're going to be eating plants, we're actually eating plants. Like we're eating fruits and vegetables. We're not going for the processed food. And if what we want to do in our house is eat less meat, we just eat less meat. Like that's just the choice we're making. So I love this. And I love what you're putting centrally here, which is the experience of the consumer, the experience of the customer. Food is an exciting area. And I think we're going to see lots more really exciting food science in the years to come, not just in manufacturing the food like through cellular agriculture and these other lab-based techniques that we're talking about, but just in the basic science of understanding what's in our food, how does it interact with our bodies, what's personalized about that, how could we be getting more nutrition, more bang for our buck, basically more nutrition with less intensive agricultural practices. So yes to everything. I love everything. Now, I have a little secret knowledge that our viewers don't have, because I have actually tried one of Shahreen's products. And so I want you to tell us a bit about the actual product that you're making and what your goals were and what the experience is like.
Absolutely. So Astrius is a performance chocolate. It is a very delicious truffle. And when you're eating it, it tastes like a high-end premium Ferrero Rocher. But what it actually delivers is 100% of your daily micronutrients. So we're talking your vitamin D, your vitamin C, your folic acid. And the potential of it is that instead of worrying about, having your full take of all your fruits and all your vegetables an entire day, everyone falls short in terms of the US population alone. We have 92% of the population that is deficient in micronutrients. So Astrius provides all of that in one delicious sphere. In fact, I actually have our box right here.
They're so good, you guys. When they're available, you should absolutely buy them. They are delicious.
Yes. So with Astrius, we created it for astronauts. And the concept in mind was that astronauts are often deficient in their key micronutrients, vitamin D being one of the core ones, because they don't have a lot of exposure to the sun. And so with one sphere alone, you have your full dose. And yet what's so important to us is it brings you a lot of pleasure and joy, and it's an experience eating it. Food is one of the only elements that gives you a full multisensory experience. So it's your taste, your touch, even the nostalgia of eating something that reminds you of your childhood. And the next iteration we have coming up, in fact, we're launching that next month, is the coffee version of Astrius. The coffee tastes like having 2 cans of Red Bull. So you have this shot of energy, but then the calming effect of tea, which comes from L-theanine. So you also have like the calm focus, and they put acetylcholine in it for like memory retention. So if you can imagine the sexiest shot of espresso and a dark chocolate ganache that's just coated in crunch and flavor. And I talk about it because for us, having performance foods that gives a functionality beyond just taste alone gives more value to what you're eating. You're eating it because you want something that brings you joy and pleasure, but also something that has a purpose so that your day is pushed along further. I found it really interesting when I went outside of the hospital one day. I was going in my car and I saw I believe he was a doctor. He was like dressed up in the scrubs, and he had 2 cans of Red Bull in his hand. Another time I was in Toronto at Mount Sinai Hospital. I was seen by a doctor around 7 p.m. and he admitted that he had lunch at 12 o'clock and didn't have a chance to even grab so much of a bite to eat in between then and now. So talk about it, because when it comes to astronauts, they are in their key peak performance, but they also are very, very time poor. And yet on Earth, when we have professionals who are using a lot of their brain functionality, whether you're a lawyer, a doctor, an engineer, you don't have the same time to enjoy food. But unlike places like France, where you sit down, you enjoy your meal, you eat with friends, here you just kind of scarf down your meal in front of a screen as you're eating. So what if you take a moment to take a step back and enjoy food that has a higher benefit and purpose?
I love it. I'm going to ask you a personal question because, of course, this is all about Tiffany. Does your new product have caffeine in it?
It does have caffeine. Yes, it has 90 milligrams of caffeine. So for us, what was important with the caffeine is it's enough to give you the energy, but not so much that you're jittery. So what's interesting with the Astrius is no one chugs down 2 cups of coffee in one go. They sip it a little bit at a time. But if you just have one Astrius, it hits you instantly and you are wired. In fact, this morning I was like, oh, I wish I had the energy sphere of Astrius with me.
Well, I'm gonna say I've been caffeine free for 10 and a half years now. It's not great. I'm not gonna tell lies about that. So I'm just gonna stump here for a second since I have you. Make a caffeine free version, please. Because with Love Ways, we've been looking for ways to do stimulation, non-caffeinated stimulation. And funnily, I had some DNA sequencing done a long time ago, and it said, oh, you've got a single nucleotide polymorphism, a change in your DNA that makes you more sensitive to caffeine.
Oh, wow.
I've known this since I was 14.
Yeah.
I've known forever that I can't have more than 1 cup of coffee or bad things happen. Like Tiffany in hummingbird mode, nobody wants to see that. So I love what you're talking about here, because you're taking a core product that is directly aligned with your moonshot. And I'm going to formulate your moonshot as making the experience of food in space as nutritious and delicious as the best food on Earth. Do you think that's the right formulation?
I love it. Absolutely.
Excellent. So this isn't 10% better. This is 10 times better, 100 times better. And what we're seeing is that your company is diversifying for a lot of ways. I remember the first time we met, Shahreen said to me, I'm really excited about this company, but if we only market to astronauts, we don't have a large enough customer base. And so that's why we're looking here on Earth. And I thought that was wonderful, because when I think about the trajectory of a business, I picture, okay, what do I want it to look like in 20 years? So then what does this business need to be in 10 years, in 5 years, in 2 years, in 18 months, in 6 months? And I think you're really personifying that in a fantastic way. So thank you for that. And like I said, I had the distinct pleasure of getting to try one of these products, and it was great. I guess this is another argument for when we can go back to being in life in person, being able to have these personal connections. We're lucky. We're in Silicon Valley. We don't live too far from each other. And so we're able to have these real in-person experiences. And I know Teleportec puts together these really great experiential programs that enable you to actually experience the things that are happening. And so maybe one day you and I will get to be in a room together with some folks and we can all do a tasting. What do you think about that?
I look forward to that. And also, hummingbird Tiffany, I love that. I think it's
it's not good. You don't want it, trust me.
Well, I almost would challenge this. Our nutritional biochemist, Joey Savage, knows his nutrition to an art form. And so the reason I mention it, I'm almost going to challenge you at some point and have you try the coffee Astrius, because we put in choline and L-theanine to bring down the level of jitteriness so that you're more calm and focused as opposed to bouncing off the wall. So I'd actually love to see what impact this would have on you on a day where, you can be a hummingbird flying around.
A day where I'm not near my family for a few hours. Yes, that's a great idea. I love it. And, if we wanted to tech this up a little bit, we would figure out something to measure in me, right? Like,
that would be
I don't know if we want to do like a blood draw or something like that. But
yes,
as I seem to remember, Matt Damon saying in The Martian, we will science the shit out of it.
I love it.
I'm into it. I'm there. I'm really excited about that. This is a fun thing about being an early adopter, right? With new products and new experiences like this one, is you get to have a chance to really explore what's going on and to come with it at a playful mentality. So, I'm a scientist by training, an experimental scientist by training. To me, everything is an experiment, and experimenting on myself is something that I absolutely love to do, especially with really smart, fun folks like you. So when we're looking forward, and so we've done a great job, I think, talking about the stuff we're excited about, the stuff we're looking forward to. What's one thing that worries you a bit when you're thinking about technology in the future?
I have to admit, something that does worry me, especially as a woman in Silicon Valley. I mean, we're very fortunate. I love meeting up with you in Palo Alto. And for me, it's always a delight when someone is right here in our backyard, because it doesn't happen very much. When it comes to investment in women, not much has changed. And it's quite interesting because I think the largest amount that the investment had come in was in 2019, which was the peak, which was 2.9% of investment going to women. And this is women who were co-founders with men as well. And I don't see the trend getting any better. And recently, the other one is, even though there has been more intentionality behind backing women, it doesn't necessarily mean that businesses change their way. So right now in California, there is a mandate to bring in more female directors. And so you will have companies that kind of parachute in directors, not necessarily women who have worked in the companies and giving them the opportunity to grow and have a real speaking role, but rather to have token figures. And it's not just this idea of not having enough funding for women in power, but also when it comes to issues that we are now aware of having a true relevance in the economy. We're talking about climate change, sustainable energy. These are very, very important factors. Everyone is aware of it now. But quite recently, I was reading an article on how the COP15 happened back in Denmark, actually, in Copenhagen. And that's when Obama had come and there was a huge rah-rah, let's go save the environment. But not much has changed. Now COP26 is coming up. It's going to be in Glasgow. And there was a picture of a little boy in Bangladesh, and I'm actually from Bangladesh, and the water levels are rising, but they have been rising. They will continue to rise. And so again, when it comes to shift in business and understanding the importance of climate change and how this can actually help your business, how this is not just the double bottom line, but it's a way of restructuring coming out of COVID. It's almost as though we've come out of a World War scenario. And yet we are not realigning in a way that addresses the challenges that we have had historically. And I think that's one of my greatest frustrations, whether we're talking about representation, whether we're talking about climate change, and be able to see businesses who can pivot in a way of authenticity and not just saying, hey, we're going to be doing this because it sounds good on your social media and it's a great PR buzz. And for me, that's not just a concern, but also a concerted reality that we always talk about our future generations having it better, but when we look back, not a lot has changed from when we were children and when our parents were children, when it came to making real strides in this direction.
Well, obviously, I completely agree with everything you've said. If we want to take an even more mercenary perspective, there have been studies suggesting that companies that have women in managerial or women founders or co-founders are actually more successful from a pure revenue standpoint, shareholder value standpoint. So even if all you care about is your business maximizing shareholder value. There are data suggesting that getting women at the table at every level, not just doing the work, but making the decisions as well, can lead to more shareholder value and to lead to more revenue. So I love that, that perspective, again, as a very mercenary, very business perspective. But I agree with you. I mean, so I am a member of the Homeward Bound 6th cohort of women leaders in STEM who are trying to train up the next generation of women who are going to be in the room where the decisions are being made about what we do about energy usage, sustainability, climate. You mentioned the COP conferences. I mean, this is all so, so important. And we see over and over again that the more diversity we have in the room, the more creativity we have, the more big thinking we have, the more experience, lived experience we have. That's how we're going to win. That's how business wins. That's how society wins. And that's how individuals win. I'm a biologist by training. Historically, biology has been more female friendly. There have been more than 50% biology undergraduate degrees going to women, for many, many, many years. But again, when you look at the professor level or above, we see this winnowing pipeline where women drop out at every stage. So what can we be doing, not just as business owners, not just as academics, but as parents and as women and as role models and as thought leaders, to be saying, hey, you can do this really amazing thing, make a difference in the world, and you can shine a light on the fact that you are coming to this space as a woman. And that, I think, is really valuable. Next week, I'm giving a talk for the Cordoba Tech Week, where they've specifically asked me to talk about women and biotechnology. And spoiler alert, of course, I'm going to be talking about CRISPR, because last year in 2020, we had Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuelle Charpentier sharing the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. 2 women sharing the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for what I think is possibly going to be the single biggest technological revolution that we see, and it's barely starting. CRISPR and gene editing for agriculture, for human genetics, for health, for all kinds of things. We are just at the very tip of that. And that foundational work was done by 2 women. And so I'm really excited to be telling that story. And I, like you, I'm keeping an eye on the investment space as well, trying to figure out what can we be doing to get the money to flow in a more inclusive or more meritocracy oriented way. So I agree. Well said. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Absolutely. And I actually had a question for you too. I'm really interested to know what your concerns are coming up and challenges and points of frustration, particularly in the world of business.
Yeah, so I think for me, that people-centered aspect is a really big one. So any type of technology, again, I'm in biotech and health, but also looking at even things as diverse as social media, as AI, as quantum computing. In my mind, you know, because I trained as a scientist and a technology developing scientist, for me, there's still this thrill of just looking to see, will it actually work? And what I'm trying to do now in my career and in my advisory work and my speaking work with companies and with individuals is to say, think beyond can we? Think to what is the real value that we are bringing here to people? And so in the same way, for me, I've been thinking the last couple of years, even before American politics went off the rails a few years ago, that trust is the world's most valuable commodity. So no matter what business you're in, no matter what industry you're in, no matter what your company, how it's formulated, what its product or services or what it's doing, how are you building and capitalizing on the trust that you have with your stakeholders and also with your customers? And I think what we're seeing is an increasing erosion of trust at all levels of society, in the private sector, in the public sector, and even in between individuals. And so what I want to see are companies, leaders who are saying, actually, we're going to try to fix that. Let's try to get back to basics. Let's get back to trust as the foundation of our relationships with our customers and with other players in our industry. And then what we can achieve, I think, is going to be really spectacular. So even when you ask me for something scary, I still manage to put a positive spin on it. I guess I'm fundamentally a very optimistic person, but I mean, I think it's going to be hard work. And I think it also requires looking at the long term in a way that people are not especially good at for a whole lot of reasons, right? As long as we are, again, focused on shareholder value, the bottom line, our quarterly reports, we are not, I think, really able to say, okay, we need to invest in something that will mature in 10 years or in 20 years or in 50 years. That's a much harder sell for CEOs and for people making these financial decisions. But I think if the pandemic has shown us anything, it's what happens when you have people who scream their heads off for 50 years that a major pandemic is happening and this is the investment that we need. And the decision makers say, no thanks, because what are the odds of it happening this year? And that's where we land. And you mentioned this reorientation coming out of the COVID pandemic. That's what I'm really hoping for. I view the COVID pandemic as a dress rehearsal for the crises that we are going to be facing thanks to climate change. So if your business has been able to handle the uncertainties of COVID, I think it's possible that your business is going to be better positioned to handle the disruption that's coming from climate change. The question is, are you as leaders willing to maintain the investment, the flexibility, all this stuff that you've done in the last year? Can you hold on to that for the years to come, for the next 20 years, the next 50 years, as we're tackling this change? So I'm watching that very carefully as well. I'm always looking to transfer learnings and to figure out, look, man, we've just been through this crazy couple of years. What can we learn and hold on to that? And how can we overcome global amnesia? What would you say is the biggest lesson you've learned from the pandemic?
I think personally, the biggest lesson I've learned is everything is cyclical. This isn't the only pandemic we've had. We've had previous pandemics before our lifetimes, and not much has changed. With the advent of so much technology and so much knowledge and so much data being shared, it still comes down to wash your hands, practice basic hygiene. And historically, it would almost seem as though everything does repeat itself, whether we're looking at politics and the pendulum it swings either very far right before it goes left again, or interest in the media or interest in companies. Everything is cyclical. Now, one part that I find really interesting, which is a change because we are becoming a more globalized society, it's this way that the pandemic impacts different ethnicities. That is very new. Geographically, of course, we would say that people who are from countries that don't have enough investment and infrastructure are suffering. But if we look at America alone, more people died here than any other country in the entire world. In it, who was affected? Overwhelmingly, African Americans, the Hispanic community. In New York, you had a lot of Bangladeshis affected. And so it's understanding healthcare and where are the needs and how are those needs going to be met. You realize that care homes for the elderly were impacted massively. In it, have they restructured? They haven't. All of the deaths that have occurred have to do with, I would say, a huge, huge deficit in basic hygiene. And so for me, the biggest concern is there's so much money being spent in healthcare. In America, healthcare is a private system. And yet, where is that money going? There's a lot of money going into homes for people who are elderly, but how is that being used? And I say it only as a reflection of where we are in society now. We can say, oh, it's unfortunate that so many people have died, but what do you do to fix the system going forward? We now have the ability to collect all of this data. Where do you put the data? How do you make sure that we process it and read it in a way that addresses these challenges that will be coming up time and time again?
Great. Yes, completely agree. Plus 100. So to kind of bring us home here, I want to ask you, what do you think businesses and business leaders can be doing in order to make money and to be cost effective as a business while still making the world a better place? What are your big recommendations to the folks out there that we're touching through Teleport Tech?
I actually don't have an answer for that one, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, Tiffany.
Well, so I think for me, one of again, this idea of staying focused on people. So I do honestly believe that businesses can be successful, businesses can bring in revenue, can have shareholder value, whatever metric you want, while making the world a better place. But I think it takes leadership. It takes real integrity. It takes a vision, and it takes dedication. And like you're saying, understanding that things are cyclical, understanding that there are going to be roadblocks, understanding that the only experiment that is a failure is an experiment that tells you nothing. That's the only real experimental failure. If you do an experiment and something doesn't work out the way it works, the way you wanted, well, okay, now you know. You did the innovation, you took the chance, you saw it through, you did your analysis, and then you made your decision. So for me, I really think that the two pieces there are having a core business vision that is aligned over multiple timescales and is building towards something. And then also having the leadership that is going to say, we believe in this mission, we believe in this vision, and we are in it for as long as it takes, come what may. For me, those are the two big ingredients. Do you want to amplify or
absolutely
or anything?
Yeah, I love that you say big ingredients, because for me, the two things, again, it's human centric, is mental health and time management. With COVID, we've realized that mental health is no longer something that's stigmatized to the crazies on the fringe, but it's something that affects all of us, the best of us, especially those who work in high stress situations. And I talk about ingredients with joy because in Silicon Valley, the big tech companies thought, okay, well, we will give them all great snacks. And when we're all working there, you are just so immersed in it. You have your snacks, you have your toys, you have, gyms and all kinds of perks and benefits, whether it's massages, whether it's, indoor pools. But none of that affects the quality of life. People are still being burnt out time and time again. And so when it comes to time management, having that ability to say, hey, you know what? Maybe you don't need to work yourself to death, because people will study so hard to get into the best universities and then fight and claw their way into the best tech companies. And yet once they're in, so many, even of my own friends who are in their, I would say, peak of who they are in the companies that they are in, all they talk about is retiring, and they just want to leave because they're burnt out. So when it comes to industries and how you can actually care for their people, it's not about giving them the best food. Food is amazing. And I think having great food is awesome, but also taking a moment to care for their mental health. Who are they? Do they have a chance to get back home? Do they have a chance to breathe and sleep and enjoy their families or enjoy their private life? And having that balance is what will lead to a company succeeding in the long run, because otherwise you will have an inevitable brain drain. And whether that brain drain means that your own employees will go to your competition because maybe the grass is greener, and they go there and they realize the grass isn't greener at all, and just have this ping pong back and forth with your own, talent leaking away to another company. But also when it comes to time management internally, knowing that you don't have to burn out as a leader. You don't have to work yourself to death to prove that you are successful, but rather being a model for your own employees. Be like, hey, I'm going to take that time to breathe. And I think Europe does an extraordinary job of this. Europe has this great sense of saying, okay, the weekends are for me. You actually take holidays. Some places like France have 5 weeks of holidays. Even the Germans, who are very, very efficient, have over a month of holidays. We don't do that enough in America. We have unlimited holidays, which means people are terrified of even taking a day off. And so I think when it comes to management of both your time, your expectations, and your employees, that's very, very important. And the other one is food, because it's not just about giving people great food, but giving them the time to stop and eat and take care of themselves. And when I say food, it's not just about the food that you eat, but also, do you have time to exercise, to meditate, to shower, to think, to engage with your colleagues in a way that you're not just, a droid that's going in there, working and coming back out, working and coming back out. So I think those are going to be really important. And COVID has made it very evident that we need to have a check on mental health, because otherwise everyone's going to burn out and it'll be the death of the company.
I recently read this wonderful book called Essentialism from someone who's at the Stanford D School, basically arguing not just for individuals, but for companies as well, really taking the time to identify what is essential and then being willing to let go of everything else, all the things that you want to say yes to, all the bright, shiny objects that you think you could be chasing, all the potential revenue streams that someone thinks are really exciting, but are not really directly aligned with your core business. Yep. Really figuring out what's essential, what's not essential, because that's the way that high-performing people can really continue to increase their impact on the world, by focusing on what's essential. And I think you just did a great job of showing us what's essential to you. So thank you for that. I think we are coming to the end of our time together. Are there any other thoughts you'd like to share? Any questions you want to ask our audience to think about? Anything like that?
Yeah, I guess my biggest question is, we now have this opportunity to set the stage of the post-COVID world, as hopefully we're going to be coming out of the Delta variant and returning to a new normal, a better normal. And so the question to the audience is, if you could change the trajectory, what would be an element of change that you think would add greater impact to the way businesses run today?
I love it. I think that's a great question. And I'll add a question of my own. What else could you change as an individual from your, with your family, with your personal relationships, that will also change the trajectory to make you the person and the leader that you want to be? Because now is the time. Now is the time for us to figure out what the next 20, 50 years are going to look like. And I'm so excited to be on that journey with you, Shahreen. Thank you so much. If our audience wants to follow you or learn more about what you're doing, where can they find you?
Of course, Astrius.co is our website, and they can find us on LinkedIn. I'm Shahreen Reza. I should be the only Shahreen Reza there, but CEO of Astrius.
Great. And I'm also on LinkedIn, Tiffany Vora. You can follow me on all the socials at Tiffany J. Vora, and on my website at tiffanyvora.com. Thank you all so much for your time. It was wonderful. Come be part of the conversation with us at Teleportech. We're really looking forward to seeing you. Bye-bye.